Are UK private boarding schools and universities a possible route for politically exposed persons to channel unexplained wealth? We'll be discussing this and more in today's podcast. My name is Ferami Adeola, and I'm the host of this podcast. I have with me for this podcast an associate fellow of the Chatham House Africa program and the author of the paper which we'll be discussing today, Mr. Matthew Page, as well as Step Up Nigeria's Executive Director, Oninego. Thank you both for joining me for this conversation today. As an introduction to our conversation, tackling money laundering remains a critical challenge for anti-corruption fighters. Politically exposed persons, also known as PEPs, who launder money are continually searching for ways to channel their illegal wealth, either through establishing shell companies in safe havens or buying expensive properties in Dubai. But there's another area that has not received much scrutiny: the education system in developed countries as a possible money laundering route. Many West African PEPs are known to send their children to study in private schools and universities, mostly in developed countries like the UK and the US. And these schools are very, very expensive and most times above the official earnings of these PEPs. So in the UK, it is estimated that more than £30 million is spent by West African PEPs in the UK education system. I mean, that's a lot of money. Could this be a possible money laundering route for PEPs? And if so, what anti-corruption measures should be used to check or prevent West African PEPs from channeling unexplained wealth into the UK education sector? So to begin this, I'll invite both Matthew and Onyi to start our conversation. I'll start with Matthew, please. Thank you again for your paper. Like we've just said before we started recording, it's such an interesting paper, so much to get out of there. So can you just tell us a bit about the rationale behind writing this paper on the UK education system? And, what was your motivation for this and what do you hope to get out of the paper?
Thank you very much for having me. It's good to be back. The motivation was really, like much of my research, reading about this issue in the Nigerian press, right? Seeing in politicians' Twitter feeds or on, in the gossip columns of newspapers that their children were graduating from these posh universities, and seeing this as obviously a trend, and seeing the commentary among civil society and anti-corruption activists like ourselves about how this behavior seems quite suspicious and potentially problematic as a way in which Nigerian political elites are spending their unexplained wealth. So rather than sort of talk about it in an anecdotal way, I thought it was really important to actually research this in depth. And fortunately, the UK government was also seeing, the UK High Commission in Nigeria and the UK government was also seeing this as a potential conduit for illicit financial flows from West Africa to the UK. And so they wanted to learn more about it. So it was a nice situation where, a research question that I had was really beginning to percolate and bubble up onto the policymakers' radar as well. And so that was my main motivation, to really take this question beyond the anecdotal, oh, we all know this is happening, isn't it terrible, to, what's really going on here? Why is it going on? What's the scope and scale of the activity? Then that's where we get that £30 million a year number, which again, I think is very sort of conservative. I mean, I think, really that's a lowball estimate, and really detail it in the paper and provide policy recommendations that will enable UK and Nigerian and other national decision makers and schools and universities themselves to potentially diminish the illicit, right, and corruption prone transactions, limit those and deter those, while not, and this is really important, while not making it more difficult for everyday Nigerians to pursue their education abroad if they would like, or, basically not tar everyone with the same brush is what I wanted to avoid from a policy standpoint in terms of addressing this issue.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. So Oyin, I would like to know what you would say are some of the implications for West African countries like Nigeria if PEPs in these countries continue to possibly use this unexplained wealth to send their children to UK institutions without any stronger anti-corruption measures put in place to hinder them?
Thank you, Farami, and thank you again, Matthew, for this excellent paper and this for highlighting this very important issue. I think one of the implications for West African countries would be the fact that it will incentivize corruption. I keep on talking about one aspect of anti-corruption that I'm personally passionate about beyond anti-corruption education is around the need to close those money laundering routes, because you always have to think about, if the space exists to keep on, hiding this wealth, then of course people will be more incentivized to, accumulate as, even monies that they don't even need in 3 generations to come. So it's safe havens like where the shell companies are being, exist, as well as golden visas now and then, this sort of international education, systems as well, which allows them to spend this money easily, makes it now, attractive to engage in corruption. So I think the implication is that, in a nutshell, I think it will incentivize corruption because there's an avenue to spend this money easily. And you would see in Matthew's report later, if you've read, I don't know if you've read Matthew's report, but somewhere along the line, they talk about shell companies being used. He talks about shell companies being used to pay school fees, in the UK as well. So it's worrying. So I think that, which is why I think it's very important that Matthew's paper is actually timely, and I think it's something worth promoting and really discussing, because this is not something that we would, like Matthew said, I mean, people, the average Nigerian, for example, can just talk about, it's not those people that send their money, their kids abroad, but they don't really, nobody's really saying, okay, so what can we do about it? Or, why does that happen? Why does it happen easily? What impact does it have even on middle-class Nigerians, or West Africans who just have genuine, they've suffered, worked hard, saved, and really want to go, abroad to study. What does this mean for inequality? The same people who steal, the resources are sending their kids abroad to get the best into one of the best, they go to the best boarding schools. Of course, when you go to the best private schools in the UK, we all know what it means. It means like you're likely to get to the best universities as well, and they're likely to get the best jobs. And then, and the same money that is being used as well to fuel this corruption is undermining the education systems in Nigeria, where it keeps on going down and down and down, and so I think the implication is that the more we have this route, the more there'll be less care as well about developing our education system, because particularly in respect of the PEPs, who are, some of them are policymakers or public officials who have the responsibility to provide these services. So in a nutshell, incentivize corruption, as well as it could lead to a deterioration of it could make our education system in Nigeria and other West African countries also deteriorate, because there'll be less interest to develop that sector since they're sending their kids abroad. Yeah, I think that those are the key points. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. Matthew also would like to know what implications you think there are for West African countries if this issue continues to persist.
Yeah, I think the sort of so what, or the implications question is really important, as Onyi highlighted. I mean, I think the huge underinvestment in the domestic education sectors, the fact that there are right, it's so difficult for an everyday Nigerian, right, to navigate the expense and process of even getting a visa to travel to the UK or US. Yet these elites, sort of who have very deep pockets, can do it with ease. This double standard, if you will, right, where you have senior policymakers in Nigeria who for the most part, again, escape to spend time in Dubai, rather than spend their time right when they're not in the Senate or in the villa. They're abroad enjoying a different standard of life than everyday Nigerians, and the same is true with education. The other issue is much more sociological, and I talk about this in the paper. And I think, people who maybe aren't, as deep in the grass of anti-corruption issues as we are, will find this part interesting, which is, why do Nigerian elites and West African elites? Because again, the paper talks about Ghana as a case study as well, because many Ghanaian elites send their children abroad, not just to the UK, but also to Canada and the US. What are sort of the motivations for doing this? And they're very complicated. And this is, perhaps a discussion for a whole separate podcast, right, about elite formation in Nigeria and identity and sort of this internal racism, right, that some elites demonstrate in terms of, how, they want their children to go to white, elite white institutions in the UK. And we see that, there's a fantastic sociologist, British Nigerian sociologist, Per Ailing, who's done some incredible research on this aspect of the topic. And she talks a lot about, again, Nigerian middle class and, and upper class perceptions of the desirability of sending their children abroad to pick up the sort of mannerisms and accent and education of a white British, young person. And to in a sense join that international elite. So my point is, and this goes for the implications, part of your question is, this is as much about money laundering, right? Taking ill-gotten gains that one has stolen from public funds, directly or indirectly, and using it to buy something, right? It's not a luxury car, it's not a luxury flat. It's something less tangible, right? A very expensive education. So you can't point to it on the drive outside a house or, at a posh address and say, there's the evidence of your ill-gotten gains, right? It's much more ephemeral. It's in the brain and soul of the child or children of political elites who obtain that education. But it's nonetheless a product of money laundering, a use of the proceeds of crime to buy something that is of value. But it's also, it's not just about money laundering, it's also about reputation laundering and about identity laundering, right? And an incredibly corrupt politician or official who, in a way has sort of, pulled themselves up by the bootstraps in the sense that they've, not come from money. They've not come from an elite status. They've used their wealth and ill-gotten gains to propel their political career forward and rise to the very top of government. And now they're looking to, in a sense, remake and recondition their whole family, right? And take their children, put them in elite institutions, give them opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have, and thereby sort of take this very opportunistic, criminal, wealth acquisition that they've undertaken, and in a sense make its effects much more permanent than one single generation, right? One car, one house, one trip to Dubai. It's about remaking an entire family name and recasting that as an elite family. So that's what's, I think, an interesting implication is it's almost perpetuating or it's like making a corruption very permanent in ways in which buying a posh car and buying a posh house are not necessarily as permanent.
Just wanted to add something because I think it's an important point that Matt has made around the societal pressures, because I think that's what's linked to this. Is this even to some extent, if I'm allowed to use the say social norms, because there's just this thing, expectation when you get to a particular level in society that when your kids, are ready to, particularly at the university stage, are you sending them abroad or which, there's no, people don't think that if you've achieved a certain status in society, they just expect that your kids will study abroad. Nobody even thinks, what I mean, or worst case, study in private universities in Nigeria. So yeah, just to agree with what Matthew said, I think is worth also thinking about that.
So next, I'd like to ask Matthew again. So now what anti-corruption measures do you think should be put in place to prevent the UK education system and other education systems that are sort of attractive to West African PEPs from being used to channel unexplained wealth?
Yeah, and this is a really important question, because I think that it's very easy on this particular issue, or any of these issues where we talk about specific types of corrupt activity, right? Where, right, in previous reports I've talked about security vote, or in previous reports, right, I've talked about Nigerian elites buying property in Dubai. And I think it's very easy to get in the habit of saying, oh, look, here's another corrupt thing Nigerians or Nigerian elites are doing. And I think that's really a wrong-headed perception or interpretation of this type of research, right? Because as many Nigerians know and are increasingly pointing out to their Western counterparts, the international financial system and Western institutions, including the UK educational sector, or educational institutions in other countries, either sort of somewhat deliberately or inadvertently facilitate or drive these types of corrupt behaviors and these illicit financial flows. And so that's not to absolve Nigerian political elites of any responsibility and claim that they're victims, and they're definitely masterminding this activity, but they're doing it with a lot of willing facilitators. They're doing it in response to incentives or a large degree of impunity in terms of their ability to move funds without questions, to be granted visas without a second look. And so this paper really, when it comes to talking about the safeguards, right, and the policy measures that could be taken, this paper really does focus on the destination of these funds, right? The educational institutions, the UK itself, because we all understand, right, the huge problems that exist around corruption in Nigeria, and preventing it and deterring it and closing loopholes, right? That's a whole massive problem set that I often research and we often talk about, and that the type of work that Step Up Nigeria is doing is trying to prevent it, like a grassroots, very sort of social youth, changing behaviors and norms, right? So there are many different parts of that. What this is really about is the conduits, right? The outflows. How is this money leaving Nigeria, and what is it being spent on? So from the standpoint of prevention and safeguards, I talk a lot about those in the paper, because, to be honest, many of them are already there and just not being used. So things like suspicious activity reports, right, which banks and other financial institutions are responsible for filing, for notifying law enforcement in the UK and Nigeria when they think a transaction is suspicious. Those are incredibly underused. So out of the over 480,000 suspicious activity reports submitted to the UK National Crime Agency in sort of the year 2018 to 2019, only 24 were submitted by UK educational institutions. 24 out of 480,000. So what that tells you is that, despite their assertions that they follow all the rules and that they, behave impeccably, UK educational institutions are not flagging as a matter of course transactions that are suspicious. And that statistic that I just mentioned is extremely shocking, given another revelation that came out this week in an front page article in the Times newspaper, which talked about how since 2015, 49 British universities allowed their students to pay £52 million in their tuition fees and other expenses using cash. Okay. Now, when we stop and think about that, right? Paying anything in cash, any major purchase in cash, right? If I go buy a house in cash, if I go try to buy a car in cash, right? The people selling me those items are going to look at me and say, sorry, we don't take cash. And I'm talking about in a Western, context. That's not like a private party sale. If I'm in Abuja and I'm buying a car from someone, and it's it's not an expensive one, I might pay cash for it. But I'm talking about, major purchases, right? Tens of thousands of pounds. And so the fact is that, again, when the Times, put Freedom of Information Act requests into these universities, it was clear that after Chinese and Indian students, Nigerian students topped the list of the types of students, paying cash to UK universities. And so, again, there's no reason why, international students can't pay through a bank transfer. And so clearly my point is that universities in this case, and independent schools, private boarding schools as well, are turning a blind eye to behaviors that should be obvious red flags. And it's not, as you can see, it's not just Nigeria. We're not picking on Nigerians or Nigerian students. This is a global problem, both in terms of where dirty money is coming from, Russia, former Soviet states, West Africa, India, Pakistan, etc., but also its destinations, UK, Canada, Ireland, Australia, US. So it's a global problem. I, being in Nigeria, someone who's focused on Nigeria all day, every day, I looked at it from a Nigerian vantage point. But that's not to say that it's a strictly Nigerian problem.
Thank you very much for that, Matthew. There's a lot you said that honestly needs a lot of thinking through again, especially from the UK government point of view. But only before we continue, you can also share your thoughts on maybe what anti-corruption measures you also think can be put in place.
One of the things when I was reading your paper this morning, I was reflecting on was, because the paper actually lists very good anti-corruption measures, safeguards. If implemented, I think that would make it very difficult. That would really go a long way in solving this issue we're discussing here today. And I will pick up on two things. One of them was, I feel like, first of all, to tackle this, as Matthew said, we really need the schools, like in the UK, and we need from the immigration as well. I think so, beyond working with the agencies like the National Crime Agency, for example, for this to fully work. You mentioned, I think Matthew had mentioned, know your customer, as well, enforcing that. I think from reading your report, you said some schools said they actually still do a bit of that, but I think they haven't gone a long way in terms of checking the source of funding. I'm not sure if they really do that from what I read in the report. But what I wanted to mention was more around the visa checks. I've always been, even beyond this particular issue we're discussing, generally I've always been a strong campaigner for visa bans for PEPs and their families. I've had interviews on this. This is my view, not just on the PEPs, but and their family. I know this may come as, it's like, why should the children suffer for sins of their fathers or whatever? But I always felt that then maybe people will reflect a little bit on their on their behavior, when they think of the implication on their children. Because I will tell you this, the generation, the current PEPs, using Nigeria as an example, may not necessarily be so crazy about going abroad, to be honest. I would use people my parents' age. They're not necessarily like, it's not a do or die affair of going abroad, but they're very particular about, their kids' education, just like we spoke earlier. It's like a big thing, for their kids to have the best, and what I mean and it's like even a pride thing. There's something they boast among their peers, and oh yeah, he's in Oxford studying. So for them, that is a key thing. And so if we use the visa as a way to really curtail some of these activities, so I wouldn't really go extreme in this case to say visa ban, but I wanted to bring it in because that has always been to solve all the just visa bans for PEPs and their families. But in terms of, if I want to be realistic of what will really happen, I would say more like, rather than focusing the current visa process, and Matthew mentioned this in the paper as well, you have to show enough money in your account that you can sustain yourself for the 3-4 years you're going to be there. So let's be real, how many people can really show this? It's mostly the PEPs and maybe a few middle-class Nigerians who have very good jobs and have managed to save. So that makes it very easy. There is nothing in the visa process that actually checks for proof of funding. then maybe it would also help to reduce, the ease at which the PEPs is not going to stop it, because people always find ways, and there's so much visa officers can do, right? At the end of the day, they also, we know there'll be some loopholes, but at least it will really help to check if they insist that, people show the proof of funds, like what's the source, not just showing your bank statement. That's what I've been asked to do at the moment. I'm not just being asked to show, I have to show the proof of how that money, the account being used to set up a business. And I think the same thing should also go for the going abroad to study. You should be able to show where the funding is coming from. And then I think, I'm not sure if this already happens, but I want to assume that this immigration officers already have access to some kind of PEPS database. I don't know. Do they, and because I think what I suspect that they have is they just have database of maybe convicted PEP, but I'm not too sure they generally even have some kind of PEP database. I know some organizations in Nigeria some years back who were trying to build a PEP database that people could pay for and then access. So like, you run it through and then you could see, okay, if someone's name, comes up as a PEP, someone's surname matches a PEP surname, then you could do further, verify if that person is linked to that particular person and then ask for more information, rather than, I think that would also solve the problem, Matthew, which you mentioned earlier about not having a process or a system where regular Nigerians also have to suffer the same process. You know what I mean? Like where it becomes also a tedious process for like people who are in PEPs, going through that same. So if there's a way, so I'm thinking this is just, I don't know what is already, I haven't really spoken to anybody in the immigration office as to what, whether they have some kind of PEP database, but I don't know whether Matthew, if that does that.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, so I think there does need to be more link up. I don't think the databases are speaking to each other. I think the immigration decisions, right, are made on very much procedural grounds, or they're flagged for other reasons. They don't, it's a box ticking exercise. We know that for the US and UK, again, Nigeria, the visa operations in Nigeria are amongst their largest and busiest in the world. Nigeria is on track to being the third largest country in the world by 2050, yet it still only has right a consulate in Lagos and an embassy in Abuja for many countries. So, and there are a high rate of overstays. So from a visa fraud standpoint, right, it's always a high risk thing. And that's not to say that, again, it's just a situation, right, of a few bad eggs spoil the bunch and make them, as any Nigerian knows who's gone through the process, it's a very difficult and arduous and expensive and time consuming process. And it's, it's evolved to become that way for a variety of reasons. So to rewind to what you were saying earlier, I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I think that, policymakers in the US and UK will talk about visa bans as if they're a tool that they ever use, and they rarely, if ever, do.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, again, I like the fact that they're thinking about them, but they need to. It needs to not be something that they put on a pedestal and they sort of break glass in the case of some sort of emergency. It needs to be a much more routine tool. And I think, again, when it comes to accountability for one's behavior, especially, again, remember, these aren't victimless crimes. I mean, the three of us on this know, but I mean, these politicians who are embezzling public funds, right, are creating a situation where Nigeria is one of the poorest, most dangerous countries in the world with the lowest life expectancy, incredibly low literacy rates, incredibly high child mortality rates. These are not, these elites' behaviors are not victimless crimes. And so, there has to be some accountability. And if that accountability is not being able to send your child to a posh private boarding school, I think I'm okay with that. And I know you are as well.
Exactly. Thanks, Matthew. So apart from the visa, strengthening the visa checks, so another area I think worth exploring is should we have some kind of anti-corruption league table for UK schools? I mean, if is this something that's going to bring some kind of pride, like saying, just have, how we have league tables, everybody get excited about league tables, and then you could just have some kind of league table where maybe even NCA themselves, if they have the time, publishes it and says, maybe like the Dulwich College you mentioned in your report is number one this year for strong AML measures and, following, some of the measures that have been put in place, will that, because people also like to have that kind of reputation of, being that kind of school that, with values, and at the end of it, I would expect anyway. So I wonder if that could help in terms of the schools, maybe incentivize them to kind of take it a bit more seriously. And also, I can tell you, I doubt if the NCA does any kind of extensive anti-corruption education in, amongst the owners, the school owners, or, heads of schools or whatever in the UK, to really sensitize them. I mean, they all know corruption is bad, but I always say it depends on how anti-corruption education is how you relay the message, right? That you get people to act. If you do not have good anti-corruption messaging that is a little bit positive and shows the cost and benefits, and people understand why the role they have to play, like why their role is very critical, then I think you may just get people thinking, oh, this is, I'm not an anti-corruption specialist, let the NCA handle this. I can't be checking, school, who is corrupt coming to my school or whatever.
Yeah, I love that idea. I mean, I think, you could envision it, right, being based on a few criteria, right? It's like anything, you'd have to come up, it's like Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, a contentious rating system, as we know, but there is a methodology to all of these things. In the case of universities, one, again, you'd need, some sort of civil society organization to say, this is really cool, let's set up a small research team to do this, because it wouldn't be difficult. It would just be labor intensive. So yeah, it would be infinitely possible. I think it'll be really cool and really useful. The only thing with these indexes, right, and we sort of suffer from this a little bit, is you get index fatigue to some degree, in the sense that every year you publish, you get the press release and the press write it up and they say, oh, this is the thing. And then what it kind of does is it just kind of antagonize, the in this case, the universities, in the case of corruption perceptions rights, the Nigerian government sort of huffs and puffs and gets grumpy, and it doesn't provoke any changes in behavior. Yeah. Now, that's not to say that it shouldn't be, right? So in other words, like, it's necessary probably, but not sufficient to change behavior. But it shouldn't all be about critiquing Nigerians, right? This is just about understanding how this problem affects Nigeria, which is what I care about most. It's what you care about most. It's what many of the people listening to the podcast care about most. But it's a part of a much bigger problem. So yeah, we beat up on Nigeria a lot, but it's not, again, we tend to lose sight of the fact that many of these issues we discuss in a Nigerian context are not unique. Nigerians are not born more corrupt than British people or Pakistani people or, Ecuadorian people. They're, human beings are born human beings. It's just about context and behaviors and systems and structures, and understanding them is the way in which we sort of change them for the better. Yeah,
totally agree. What do you think about the unexplained wealth orders? Because I know that there's a threshold of £50,000, which is why I'm not sure if it, in terms of they have to go for them to initiate an unexplained wealth order. It has to be for things above £50,000. So I don't know if that could work in schools.
Yeah, I mean, it could do. I think there are a few problems. One is, the unexplained wealth order process from a legal and procedural perspective, my understanding is it's still in its infancy, its early days. They've had one high profile unexplained wealth order filed, and that was, defeated, that was upended in a court battle, in a fairly questionable legal decision, in my opinion. This was against a Azerbaijani PEP, I recall, and Azeri PEP. And so, so far the process is off to a very rough start, where we're dealing with relatively small amounts of money across a huge number of people, right, that add up to a significant amount, but individually, right, it's £10,000 here, £20,000 here. And you're talking about individuals. That means individual case, individual process, and so forth. There's kind of a threshold, and we know that anti-corruption law enforcement is, in both Nigeria and in the US and UK, is still fairly under-resourced in terms of the scale and scope of the problem. They tend to focus their energies, needless to say, on what we would call the big fish or the low-hanging fruit, whatever metaphor you want to use. But basically, right, the targets where there's significant amounts of funds, tens of hundreds of millions of pounds. The Desani sort of incidents, or individuals where it's just the legal or procedural case is a slam dunk and very straightforward. And they, when you talk about lower down the money and funding scale, and the more difficulty in proving a predicate crime, right? So a predicate crime being how you got your ill-gotten gains in Nigeria in the first place, right? Which is very, very difficult to prove if you're sitting in the UK or the US and so forth. It's doable, but it's quite the process and requires a lot of cooperation from the EFCC and what have you. So basically, to answer, that was a long answer to a very concise and clever and short question. The answer is, unexplained wealth orders, hopefully in our lifetimes, will be something that is a fact of life and used more effectively, but it's still such early days yet. And that's why you and I keep coming back to the issue of visa sanctions, because visa sanctions are there. They're so discretionary. People are refused visas, out of however many Nigerian applicants a day, right? Tons of people are refused visas for much less serious reasons. So it's something that's happening routinely in other contexts. Why not apply it to an anti-corruption context? It's not, again, it's necessary, but not sufficient for having a coherent, functioning anti-corruption policy. And again, I said this earlier in the podcast, but the real failure on the part of US, UK, European, other countries' policymakers is that they've been so reluctant to just routinize, to make this sort of a standard tool in their toolbox.
So much in the last 15 minutes. Thank you both so much. I would like to just round up by asking, if there's one thing you want people to take away from reading your paper, Master, just, one tidbit, what's the call to action, like once they're done, what's the one key message you would like people to take away from the paper?
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, I think it goes back to, what we were talking about earlier on the podcast, right? Which is what's as important as the takeaway, right? That this is a problem, that Nigerian PEPs spending money at UK universities could be a financial, we think it's a illicit financial flow, in some respects. Again, PEPs, politically exposed persons, not you or Onyi or many of our listeners. These are not the type of people who need to be pulled up in this net. But that's really key. Is I think that it's very easy to look at this report, and I think some of the criticism that I've heard from some corners about this report is, again, saying, oh, this is trying to, paint Nigerians as corrupt and not worthy of, attending UK universities. And that's definitely not the case. The educational links between the UK and Nigeria and the UK and the US and Nigeria are deep and old and durable and important, and and have really important positive cultural impacts. So this isn't meant to try to undermine that. It's actually about strengthening it, right, and making it more sustainable over the long term, right, and preventing it from becoming something where, again, the problem gets out of control, and then countries, like we saw with Trump's visa ban against Nigeria, right? Countries can sometimes take very draconian measures in response to problems. So it's best to prevent an issue from becoming a problem and a crisis early on than it is to ignore it until it becomes a major issue that countries crack down on. So that's my key takeaway, I guess, is that don't don't think of this paper as a critique of Nigerians attending UK universities. It's really about understanding the nuance of what's a very long-standing connection between Nigeria and the UK.
Thank you very much. Only likewise, what's one key message you think readers of this paper should take away once they're done?
When I read the paper, right, one of the things that I was really reflecting on, and which I think I mentioned earlier in discussions, was around the various money laundering, routes that, we really need to close to, make it difficult for corruption to occur. So money laundering routes such as the golden visas, now with Matt's paper on unexplained wealth for expensive international education by West African PEPS, and then shell companies, they're all intertwined. That's what I reflect, my key reflection from this. And they all provide safe havens to spend ill-gotten wealth. And we need like a comprehensive approach that can tackle all these routes simultaneously. One solution cannot solve all the, we're not going to have it's not just one thing, like visa ban alone, like Matt mentioned, will not solve this problem. But there's I think a holistic strategy that looks at all these international routes to money laundering. It's really much needed to have it integrated, particularly now that I'm reading for the first time from Matt's paper that, shell companies are being used to pay school fees in the UK and the other places. So I think it's worth, I think this calls for a deeper reflection on how to close the international corruption routes. So that's my key reflection.
Thank you very much, Oyi.
Thank you.
Thank you both for a really interesting discussion. I also think a lot more needs to be done focusing on asset recovery. So asset declaration in Nigeria. I think it's important that they enforce more public officials declaring how much they have, what buildings. And so this also helps universities and even the countries better gauge if these persons are able to fund the educations that they are sending their children for. So thank you both for a very interesting discussion. It's been really insightful and giving so much food for thought. And I know that our listeners have enjoyed this for sure. So for our listeners, you can read Matthew Page's paper called West African Elites Spending on UK Schools and Universities, a Closer Look, on the Carnegie Endowment for Internal Peace website. So you can just Google that and it'll come up, I'm sure. Thank you both for your time. This was a really good podcast. And this brings us to the end of today's show. Thank you.
Thank you.